Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. In the 1950s, George Reeves embodied the Man of Steel in Superman's first television adaptation. From its gritty black and white beginnings to the kid-friendly color years, to this day, an entire generation reveres George as their Superman, while for others, the show remains an overlooked chapter in the character's mythology. On this podcast, we bring everyone together as we break down each episode of Adventures of Superman. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 2, Episode 25, The Whistling Bird, is the host of the Krypton Report podcast, returning guest, Tyler Patrick. Welcome back for the penultimate episode of Season 2.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back and talking some more of George as Superman. And, having a chance to dive into Season 2 has been interesting.
Do you have any history with this episode? Had you watched it before, or was this the first time for this recording?
This is my first time watching it. But there was some charm to this episode, and we'll get into why. But yeah, I enjoyed this one for several reasons.
Yeah, there was some good stuff in this episode that I'm excited to talk about. Are you familiar with the episode, The Machine That Could Plot Crimes, that introduced Uncle Oscar?
I'm not super familiar with it, but I did catch your episode on it, and I did want to go back and rewatch it because I was watching with the podcast, but then I had to do some watching for my own stuff, and then of course that just got behind.
No, I totally understand. It's well worth watching, and as I said in that discussion, the fact that it had to follow Panic in the Sky is a tall order, and I think it did a great job. And it introduced one of the few recurring characters on the show in the form of Uncle Oscar, played by Sterling Holloway, who will come back as a different character at the start of Season 3 for that time travel episode. He's a different scientist there, but he makes 2 appearances as Oscar in Season 2.
I have a list of characters from Superman and Batman media that are just these like oddball characters that appear that aren't in comics, that if one day I ever got to write a comic, I would allude to or bring in. And I just think that he'd be a fun, kind of quirky character to have.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess we're used to characters like the Professor Emil Hamilton, for example, like sort of that scientific figure in Superman's life. And I guess it's a very different lane here for Oscar. He's eccentric and whatnot, but yeah, I mean, you definitely could see a place for him potentially in other stories. I mean, I don't mean to dwell on this, but it comes up from time to time in these discussions where we fully recognize and accept this was not a heavily or at all serialized show. But nevertheless, I am always a little bit perplexed when we have so many actors who come back as different characters, and you sort of wonder, well, like, if you're reusing actors anyway, is there not an opportunity to have them play the same character and just create a little bit more of a sense of continuity? I don't even mean continuity in terms of like the ongoing narrative, but just continuity in terms of just like connective tissue, making it feel like more of this lived in world.
I just feel like that was a thing of past cinema, period. Like, maybe it comes from like the age of like the stage play and stuff, where you just had a troupe of actors that would just recycle every play. Because I'm a big fan of the old classic Universal monsters, from the 30s, 40s and everything. And they reused actors in all their productions. Not even like the first true sequel, you could argue. Well, I mean, you could argue was for the Wolfman. They did the Wolfman Meets Frankenstein, and one of the actors from the first Wolfman movie is back as a completely new character. So when you watch them back to back, you're just kind of like, what? But they didn't look at it the way that we do. I mean, what's hilarious, even you say that, is we are both big fans of Supernatural. And towards the later seasons, they brought back a couple of actors as completely new characters. And I don't know if you were, but me at the time, I was thinking, oh, this is a little comment on what's really going on, that because there was theories about what Sam was dealing with, and I won't deal that. But I'm like, oh, it's because this person, we're seeing them again as something else. It's not really them. Like, this is because this is happening. But no, they just brought back the actor as another character because they'd already burned through every actor in Canada. So I just feel like they're just like, yeah, come on back, man. We had fun working with you. You can be this guy now. Okay. And you just went with it.
Yeah, no, and that's totally fine. I guess I think about it when we do an episode like Semi-Private Eye, and we have a private detective in the mix. And meanwhile, we had one of those in season 1 in the form of Candy Myers. And it's like, oh, it would have been interesting if he had been the private detective in this one. But I think even beyond that, I feel like there are characters who are introduced and we're told, like, this is one of Clark's best friends. And it's like, oh, wow, this must be an important person in Clark's life. But you never see them again. Again, it's just sort of one of the ongoing questions I have in my mind. But all that to say, look, let's not take that out on this episode, because this is an episode that actually brings back an actor as the same character. They do the thing that I've been clamoring for. I guess I'm happy to see it. I wish it weren't such an isolated incident, but it's awesome. Now I will say, and I know I'm jumping ahead and I'll go back and I'll give my summary and all that stuff, but there was a line that really jumped out at me in this episode, or very early on in that first scene, where Clark makes reference to the fact that he hasn't seen Uncle Oscar for 2 years. So now that just like completely blew my mind in terms of what is the timeline of this show? How much time is passing in between episodes? It's been 2 years apparently since the last time he saw this guy.
I heard that and I thought, okay. And I hadn't really sat down to think about, wait a minute, that was just earlier in this season. It was probably just one of the, it's one of those I'd love to go back in time, kind of pick their brains on things, because they'd be like, why do you care so much about this story? Doesn't it make sense? It's just TV, like what about the continuity? What? Yeah.
I would love to have that conversation. That's probably how it would go. I guess I just wonder, because it's like, they know he was in this other episode, and it wouldn't have made any difference if Clark had said, I haven't seen him in 2 weeks, 2 months. It really makes no difference. Like the fact that there's some period of time this guy has been off working on some new invention, right? So, but they chose to put 2 years on it. And then I'm just thinking, like, yeah, I wonder, I mean, each season of Adventures of Superman is covering years for all we know.
I mean, I always like using, I don't like to be super descriptive when I'm writing or anything. So like, oh man, it's been a while since I've seen him. I like to use those type of, like, you can kind of adjust it to what you need it to be terms. Or if he had returned and his first appearance was in season 1, sure. But yeah, just like, it's been 2 years. For real? So why is Jimmy still a child? Why do you guys still treat Jimmy like a child?
Yeah, when is Jim going to be able to stay at the apartment by himself?
When is Jim now a man? Like,
yeah. Well, in any event, The Whistling Bird, March 6th, 1954, written by David Chandler, directed by Tommy Carr. I will give my detailed summary of the episode, our roadmap, then we'll jump around. We'll talk about what stood out to us. Nancy, niece of eccentric scientist Oscar, tells Jim and Kent about her uncle's latest mysterious invention, which he's been working on for 2 years and has only shared with his assistant, Skylar. At the lab, Oscar explains that he entrusted the missing piece of his formula to a talking parakeet, aka Skylar. The invention is a flavored glue for stamps, but when Kent presses the stamp onto an envelope, it explodes. Afterward, Jim develops his photo from the lab and notices 2 people looking in. At the park, a beautiful woman sits next to Oscar and the bird. Clark arrives and takes Oscar aside, and while they talk, the woman switches the birds. Later, she and her 2 accomplices prove unable to get the bird to supply the missing piece, just as Oscar is initially perplexed when Skylar, aka the bird double, will not cooperate. The criminal trio burst into Oscar's lab and threaten to hurt Jim and Nancy unless Oscar cooperates. They even throw Lois and Superman off the scent by hiding behind a lead wall. Ultimately, Oscar, Jim, and Nancy start a fire to set off the alarm, but risk drowning themselves when the sprinkler goes off. Superman arrives in time to save them, drink the remaining chemical solution before it explodes, and save the fleeing criminals before their sample goes boom. So yeah, overall thoughts about this one?
It was fun, playful, and definitely a little ridiculous. In the sense of flavored glue for a stamp. You know, because I'm like, we have tape, right? You know, the sad part is here soon people be like, what's a stamp? But you know, like our stamps now are like stickers. But I was just like, that was just kind of hilarious that he was, you know, dead. He's like, the line about making it like beef stew. It was beef stew, plate of vegetable, lamb, liver. And I was just like, she just used tape. But yeah, when they put the stamp on and they hit it and it goes boom. But then you watch that scene, it's hilarious because everyone gets blown back and the lamb's destroyed and Clark's still standing there. And nobody reacts that Clark is still standing there unaffected by the exploding stamp.
It's wild because you would 1000% expect someone to say, Clark, how are you okay? It's like they don't even bother. And part of me says, oh, that seems like a plot hole. But then I'm like, you know what? How many times are we going to have to sit through this, right? Where he comes up with some kind of excuse. So the fact that we didn't even bother with it this time, I'm like, all right, that's fine.
He was like, oh, I was, yeah. But
yeah,
I just found that whole like stamp thing hilarious.
The stamp thing was so funny because Oscar and, you know, sweet, odd, eccentric Oscar, he just wants to do something to benefit humanity. And he says something to the effect of like, what do people hate more than anything else? Right. And his answer is licking a stamp so that it will stick. Like that's what people hate more than anything in the entire world. Like that's what he's devoted years of his life and his research to, is solving this problem. I mean, to your point, yes, there could be other ways to affix a stamp. What we would ultimately land on, these self-adhesive stamps that essentially function as stickers, you know, that doesn't necessarily cross his mind. His choice of flavor for the stamps, also kind of wild. I don't know. I don't know if beef stew is necessarily the direction I would have gone in, though Clark seems quite pleased with it. So that was fascinating. I was thinking
like cherry, strawberry, grape.
But at the same time, it's perfectly in keeping with Uncle Oscar. I feel like this is totally on the money.
I was gonna say it works because Sterling Hollowell's performance, you just find his charm and you buy into it and you don't care about nothing. Like you're like, whatever, I'm going with it.
Absolutely. And so kind of on that note, our guest cast. So we have Sterling Holloway returning as Uncle Oscar, a long career, including being the voice of Winnie the Pooh.
Which I mean, he's Winnie the Pooh. He's from the Aristocats. He's Kaa the Snake, the Cheshire Cat, and then he later played the adult Flower in Bambi, and Mr. Stork in one of the earlier shorts. We had recently watched Alice in Wonderland. My daughter had picked it. So like just his voice has such that charm. It's so recognizable. You're like, yeah.
Yeah, it is very distinct. Joseph Vitale as the thug. He was Cap in My Friend Superman not too long ago. He's the one I commented in that episode. He was like combing his hair like he was Fonzie. Then we also have Otto Waldis as the enemy scientist. He's from Austria, this actor. Tony Carroll as Dorothy Manners, the woman who quote unquote seduces Oscar in the park and takes his bird. And Aline Roberts as Nancy Quinn. She was in The Haunted Lighthouse and also in The Monkey Mystery, 2 episodes from season 1.
I thought she was in The Haunted Lighthouse. I thought so. And I even thought to look it up, but I didn't. And I was like, maybe Anthony timed this on purpose. he was like, we're going back to the lighthouse.
Nope,
Tyler.
that was just a happy accident. But yeah. So there's overall, I would say a silly episode, but I was happy just to have that returning character because I just feel like it gives you just a strong jumping off point. Like we already know who this guy is, but even if you had never seen that previous episode, you get everything you need to know about Uncle Oscar here. But I enjoyed that. And yeah, there's some great bits here. I mean, in the opening scene, Jim brings the niece Nancy into Clark's office and Clark's asleep.
Yeah. I was like, okay, is he faking it? What's going on? What are you doing, Clark? But
when Jim wakes him up and Clark tries to play it off, I had to play it a couple times. Did he say he was fainting or faking? I heard fainting.
Okay, that's what I heard, but there's no captions. So I was just like, okay, just gonna go with it.
Here's my theory. It was a real late night at the Tip Top Club the night before. I'm telling you, guys, this guy is a party animal. He's just, I don't know, dancing the night away or whatever he does at the Tip Top Club. And even with his super abilities, he was a little tired. It was just a funny little bit of business, I thought, to have him asleep on the job at his desk.
I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, my favorite was the lady trying to flirt with Uncle Oscar, and he's that classic nerd scientist who's so oblivious to all signs, and she's like doing everything, and he's just so focused. I love that trope.
While we're on that scene in the park, it was a bit of a stretch to me that I know they make the point that Clark walks Oscar a good bit away behind the bushes to have this conversation with him about what Jim captured in his photo. Nevertheless, Clark was still facing in the direction of this woman on the bench. He also has X-ray vision, as we've talked about. He's not always using it every second, but still, the fact that she was able to switch the birds right under his nose was a little surprising to me.
You know what it reminded me of, Anthony? Remind me of that last episode that we did where Clark shows up, and while Clark shows up and turns the attention of all the police and everyone is when the wrecker takes the money.
Yeah.
And no one was paying attention. It's like, Clark, you're not helping, dude. Like, you're actually causing problems.
I know. But going back to the office in that first scene, the niece shows up and talks about how Oscar has this new invention and he won't tell anyone about it. The only one who knows anything is his assistant, Stanley. And that's when we have this business about, I haven't seen him in 2 years since he retired. And as they go off, Clark directs Jim to get his camera, which I thought was interesting because, normally the way he's played here, it's the cub reporter. It's not usually in the capacity of a photographer like we typically associate with Jim.
Which makes me start to wonder, like watching this, and I haven't pulled out like the comics. When did Jim go from that cub reporter to more of the photographer, Jimmy Olsen? Because later, that's what when we think Jimmy Olsen, we think of the camera.
Yeah, for sure. So just to kind of have that here, and I haven't been tracking this. I'm sure it's not the first instance we've seen on the show of him with the camera in his hands, but again, it was a very specific direction that Clark gave him. And I was just like, oh yeah, like that's Jimmy Olsen, Shutterbug.
You're like, good job, Clark. It's like that Jimmy's going to need that camera.
Yeah. Yes, obviously I know that's the thing. It ends up being this important plot point that Jim captures these two people looking in. So I guess that's
which is hilarious.
Why,
I had to laugh. I had to laugh because just the picture of them, the way they're looking in, was hilarious.
Yeah, that was funny. Before that, though, there's again the scene with Oscar, right? Again, very absent-minded. He doesn't even realize they're there, and then he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and they're like, "No, we just got here," and he explains his whole process where he did not write down the entire formula, right? In case it were stolen. And in fact, there had been this break-in and his notes were taken, but they didn't get the vital piece, which is what he entrusted to his talking parakeet, the pet bird, Stanley. And so we hear it twice in this episode, this missing piece of the formula. So it's CO2 plus 1 liter of manganese acetate soluble catalyst in zinc oxide. It's been a very long time since my high school chemistry and AP chemistry day, so this really meant nothing to me, but there you go.
CO2. I was with you.
There you go.
Then after that, I was like, and I'm done.
Yeah.
I did not do so great in chemistry because it was my second to last class, and my teacher was super hyper and enthused, and like everything was like on, like she was always like, okay, are you ready? Okay, good. Get your pencils out. Let's do this. Okay. Did you figure it out? Let's go.
Whoa.
And you're just like, and I'm just like, how are you just, yeah, just like shell shock. But I thought the bird's name was Skylar.
Did I say Stanley?
Yes.
Oh, it is Skylar, isn't it?
Okay. I was like, did I hear it wrong?
Where did I get Stanley from?
Wasn't that somebody's name you said earlier? Like a guest or a character they played?
No.
I don't know.
No, I think you're right, though. Skylar, isn't it? I don't know where I got Stanley from.
I was like, because I looked down at my notes like,
Good
like,
catch. Good catch.
Huh.
But I don't know. I must have had Stanley in my head from something. Oh, that's quite a mystery.
I don't know.
Well,
But
I talked
like,
when we did our one of our recent episodes. I talked about that whole dream I had about John Hamilton. Maybe Stanley will come to me in a dream, and we'll have an answer for that.
I just like, okay, so we're talking about the fun that there's a fake wall in Uncle Oscar's room where he used to do his experiments, and Jim and Oscar and his niece get put back there. And I just love the idea of, we'll set off the sprinklers. He'll send the fire department. But then they're like, great idea. Wait, nobody knows we're back here, that this even exists. I was like, okay. And then I got kind of confused at the placement of everything, because I don't know if I missed it. They said that was in the basement or whatever, because you have the people looking in from the street. Then they're in the back room, but then somehow Superman is like in a living room and punches down and pulls them up as the room's filling full of water. So I got kind of lost on the layout of everything.
Yeah, the layout, that is a good question. I think maybe the lab and that compartment behind the lead wall were the basement, right? And then the living room is above, and that's what he punched down into.
I mean, it makes sense, but then I'm like curious about where this sits, because they're looking in off the street into the basement, and it looks like, I don't know. I don't know. It's just weird. But
I listened to the Boy Meets World rewatch podcast, and
hey, me too.
It's good, right?
Yeah.
And there's this ongoing debate about whether or not it's a side yard or a backyard. Like, they're constantly trying to figure out the geography of the neighborhood and the layout of the house. And it is a good question.
Oh, there's an episode I can't wait for them to get to, but that's a whole nother conversation.
But in any event, you mentioned before about how when the explosion goes off and Clark is just standing there and nobody says anything. So according to the book, Flights of Fantasy, in the original script, it was Jimmy who affixed the stamp onto the envelope. And I obviously, they came to their senses and switched them out with Clark, because I don't know that Jimmy would have fared too well.
Yeah. Oh, Jimmy. Yeah, he would have been. I mean, Uncle Oscar was right there and he got blown back. So, Jimmy, I guess, would have made a little bit more sense, because then we wouldn't be asking, how is Clark not moving? So
the overall conceit of this episode, right? That Oscar, he can't remember the full formula, but rather than write it down and risk it being stolen and used by someone else, he entrusts a key piece to this talking bird. Do you look at something like that, you're like, this is too silly, or does it work for this episode and this character?
Oh, it works for this character. He seemed like the type of person that would do that.
Yeah, I
Like
agree.
he would keep a bird like, or or a monkey or a lab rat or some sort of like animal. The fact that it can talk, and like, oh, I didn't want to remember the formula, so it could never be stolen. So I taught my bird this. What happens if the bird dies? There's all kinds of questions, but he doesn't feel like he thinks like that.
Yeah. So I got to tell you, there are a few absolute standout Clark moments in this that like truly made me laugh, and I feel like are all-timer George Reeves scenes. One of them is after the initial explosion, where Oscar's going to go take the bird to the park, and we talked about that. But Clark goes back to the planet, and Clark has this whole side thing where he brings the explosive capabilities of this chemical solution to the government, right? Because he knows that the authorities are going to want to know about this. But when Clark's back at the planet and he's telling Lois about this, Lois is so skeptical, right? She doesn't believe him. And she's like, if you don't tell me, I'll find out some other way. And he goes, all right, bye. It's like, it just made me, it was so funny.
My favorite is just, it's a George thing, but it's like, so we see him drink the formula, right? And then when he goes to the bad guys who has an even bigger thing, he holds it and he goes to drink. It's like, nah, you're not. He says, you're not worth saving. Run. Like that was I was like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, that was the other huge thing on my list here. So yeah, I mean, there's this bit earlier, right after he rescues the trio from the water, which now you were talking about this whole business with setting off the alarm. I mean, the fact that the sprinkler dispensed that much water that they were minutes away from drowning is a bit severe, but okay. But anyway, Oscar finally realizes the mistake, right? And about the reaction that these chemicals can have over time. And so there's a small amount in the beaker on the in the lab, and that's what Superman drinks to protect them all from the explosion, right? And we don't see him when it explodes, but we see the others, and the room is shaking and everything, and he has a little indigestion after that, right? But then, like you're saying, when he tracks down the trio at this cabin, because the parakeet who flew away, they think he escaped, but it turns out one of the guys set him loose because they didn't want the bird. Talks about El Dorado, this ghost town upstate, apparently.
Yeah.
And so Superman gets there. This was my favorite scene of the entire episode, where Superman bursts in and he sees the big container of the solution, and it's about to blow, and he picks it up and he's about to drink it again, like he did before with the smaller batch. And he goes, oh no, not again. Which I love that. Oh no, not again. And then exactly as you described, he's like, you three aren't worth saving, but run for your lives. And they all just run out, and then it explodes and it takes out the cabin. And it's just, I don't know. It just felt like such a real moment, especially from this version of the character. And look, you and I, man, like we've experienced so many stories across media from all time periods, but especially the modern era that we grew up in, where all life is precious to Superman. Save lives at all costs, save everyone. And again, here he does ultimately alert them, right? But even just the notion, like, you aren't worth saving. Again, it really jumped out compared to what we've seen these days, but it felt perfectly in keeping with the show and this era, and it was genuinely funny. Oh man, I love this.
Oh, I laughed, and I chuckled, and I wrote it down, and not again made me think almost like they didn't tell George that he would have to drink, and he was like, and he popped in, he was like, oh, not again, I don't want to drink this. And he was just kind of like,
yeah, it was just like a real, like, just the notion that he internalized this explosion and he didn't want to do it again, especially a larger version of it. Like, that just felt so real.
Yeah.
Do you feel any sort of way about you're not worth saving? Are you like, oh, that's not Superman? Or are you like, no, I get it in this time, in this version?
I get it as someone who's read some Golden Age comics, who've seen the show some, um, because like you like to joke about all the people that he takes and puts on top of the mountain somewhere, and just leaves. Like I'm not. It's like the whole I'm not going to save you, but I'm not going to kill you either. Um, so it was. I mean, it was shocking because I'm like, yeah, something I wouldn't see Superman say, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense why this version would say that to them. So
Yeah. Oh man, it was genuinely funny. And then you get the little tag at the end there where the bird is back in the Daily Planet office, and the parakeet is calling Clark Superman, and also whistling at Lois. Right, just
well,
as he had whistled at the woman in the park.
he calls Clark Superman, and they're like, oh, that bird doesn't know what he's talking about, blah blah blah. And then he whistles at Lois, and then they're kind of like, the bird doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the idea was, Lois takes the compliment. They're like, but you just said the bird's unreliable.
Yeah, so it's like, which one is it, Lois? Does the bird know
Yeah.
what it's talking about or not? And then she just kind of smiles. That actually, I thought that was a fun little button for this episode.
Yeah.
Look, I've complained about various buttons in the past. This one felt like a perfectly in keeping note to end the episode on. So I thought this was very effective.
Oh, I agree. Because I found this just entertaining and enjoyable, period.
Yeah.
I like this episode.
What have we not talked about that you want to with this one?
Man. I'm looking over my notes here. I don't know. I think we hit like everything, like the park, Jim in the, oh no, we got to set the thing on fire but yeah, I think we hit it all.
It was, speaking of Jim, there's a moment where he puts his arm around the niece, which it's like, oh, maybe Jim's got a little romance in his future. There's some bad edits there, though, because there's one point where you see him with his arm around her, and then like immediately after it's clearly down, so that using different takes or whatnot. But just the fact that he was showing that kind of like physical affection, I thought was interesting. Obviously, it doesn't go anywhere, but interesting.
They're like, all right, Jim, you get a girlfriend at the end of this episode. All right, so in the next episode, no, Jim, there is no next episode. She doesn't come back. But I just got a girlfriend. Yeah, in that episode, Jim. Not again.
Yeah. Well, I guess the last thing to do here is to rate this episode on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. How many would you get? The last time you were here for Beware the Wrecker, you dropped a 1 fedora on it. So how many does the Whistling Bird get?
I'm going to go 3. And even though I feel like it's light on the Superman, it's an entertaining, fun episode. And I bring it to Uncle Oscar for just his portrayal, his energy, his charm. It makes it more fun and interesting. And, Jimmy is utilized well in this episode. He's not being chastised by Perry White. And I feel it just makes it more of a fun episode and like a good time. Like when this one was over, I was like, oh, that was cute. Even though like the idea of the exploding stamp glue is ridiculous, it still works somehow.
Totally. Okay, so I also give this 3 fedoras. For me, this is like a solid 3 episode where, it's not compelling to the degree that I often crave and that I think the show is capable of, but it's solid. And I don't really have, is it a stretch that Clark doesn't see the woman switching the bird at the park? Yeah. But like for the most part, there wasn't anything where I was really kind of taken out of the episode or I felt there were major plot holes or things like that. Like, yes, it was silly, but it was silly in context, like in keeping with particularly the character of Uncle Oscar. I felt like it was appropriate given the character we're dealing with. And it was fun. And I was just happy to see the character back. And again, this episode gave rise to truly, some of my favorite Clark moments, him asleep at the desk. I know it's very minor and really kind of dumb for me to fixate on it, but I just thought it was just kind of a very interesting choice. The all right, bye to Lois genuinely just hit me out of nowhere. And I thought it was so funny. And then, yeah, I mean, the bit about not wanting to drink the solution again, it was fantastic. Like just such a standout. So a real solid, strong 3 for me on this.
Cool. I like when we're on point.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it'd be more interesting if we were wildly split on this. If you're like, this is a 5. And I was like, no.
I mean, it probably would be more interesting, but at the same time, I feel like most people probably just be like middle of the road with this one. Like, yeah, it's good, but it's nothing great, but I don't really have any complaints.
Yeah. So what would you like to share with folks about Krypton Report podcast?
Just, check us out. We are on all major podcast platforms. In 2025, we're gearing up for some fun stuff. I'm going to have a segment for a few months called Jania Reviews, where I'm having her review some of the most talked about Superman trades, ones that come up in a lot of conversations that she hasn't read yet. And Saturday mornings with Superman, where we are watching Superman the Animated Series every Saturday between 8 and 9 a.m. live watch along. So that's been fun. But yeah, check out the podcast and see where we are in our super rating as we review Superman and Lois and just making our way through some comics.
Awesome. Well, check it out. The link to your link tree will be in the show notes. I thank you, Tyler. I thank you, audience. Make sure you come back next week for the season 2 finale, Around the World with Superman. We made it. We're also going to hit on Stamp Day for Superman as well. So you don't want to miss it. It all comes to a close, the black and white era, that is, next week. So until then, remember, only Superman can do super things. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville Rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, a weekly exploration of Superman's vast 85-year mythology, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.